Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm gonna be testing the Avengers video game once again. As you'll see, this is a different kind of video that I usually do. I usually test the games and talk in the background while you're watching the benchmark. Well, this time around I want to talk about the options menu by myself in a separate video, since I know that not everyone is interested in that part of those videos. So if you're here, thank you. I'm trying to do something different. So first, let me show you the options menu. This is not meant to be super in-depth. This is not Digital Foundry. They are way better at that than me. So I'm using at the moment a 1650 Super and Ryzen 5 3600. We're going to talk about RAM usage, video memory usage, CPU usage, all that. But first, let's take a brief look at the options menu. So I'm using 1080p at the moment, no dynamic resolution. This will be important. The aliasing will be on TAA. SMAA doesn't look that good in this game. And the graphics, I'm using the very high preset with every option that I can maxed out except in textures. We're going to talk about that too. So yeah, the game is basically maxed out except in these enhanced water simulations and destruction effects and the textures, because we only have 4 gigs of VRAM. So let's talk about this first. So this is the quality of the textures that are in the game. And if you have a 4GB GPU, I recommend using medium. If you use higher than medium, it should be fine if you are below 1080p on a 4GB card. But I think that medium is the best of both worlds, and you want to max out your 4GB GPU. If you have more than 4 gigs, I recommend using high. On Nvidia, 6 gigs should be fine, and if you are on AMD, an 8GB card should suffice for high textures. Then if you have less than 4 gigs, use low. 3 GB of VRAM, I don't know, 2 GB, use low, because this game uses a lot of video memory. So yeah, with that out of the way, sorry about that. We are now in one of the demanding areas of the game with the maximum settings again, except in textures. And as you can see, we're getting over 40 frames per second just fine. In the campaign, something similar to this happens. You might be over 50 in the bridge level, but this has way more geometry and way more effects happening at the same time. So that's what I'm trying to show you right now. For more enemies, I'm going to use one of these special attacks. So when this attack happens, as you can see, with more things happening at the same time, it drops into the 30s. So we were into the 40s, we dropped into the 30s. No big deal, should be okay. If you're aiming for 30 frames per second, in most cases it's fine. But then more effects show up and we drop into the low 30s. Then I do some attacks. I get into the Hulkbuster, and as you can see, the performance can decrease quite a bit in a very short amount of time. Then it will stabilize, but you have to aim for something. I mean, if you think that this is 40 frames per second, well, it's not. When you're playing the game, actually doing something important, the frame rate will just drop into the 30s. So in that case, that will be a 30 frames per second experience, because in the worst case scenario you're getting 30 frames, but then in the campaign you're probably going to get 60 most of the time. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the game is very variable, especially when there are tons of effects going on at the same time. This is another example, one of the stronger enemies in the game in this level. Just by looking at them from this side will already decrease our frame rate. So let's do that. Alright, so looking from this way, when I'm getting attacked and I'm using a special ability, I already get dropped into the upper 20s. Again, worst case scenario type of thing. That's why I'm always testing this level. For some reason, this specific spot with many enemies and all the heroes attacking at once, just a decently big battle going on. You can already see a significant difference in performance. Sometimes it's not even dropping from 40 to 30, sometimes it's from 60 to 30, depending on what you're doing. So we were using basically the highest settings. We're going to drop into high. Now when we drop into high, we go into the 50s, and then medium, we drop into the mid 50s. So let's see how stable that is. We keep it on medium without motion blur because it looks bad in this game, at least in my opinion. So as you can see now, it's way smoother, significantly more smooth, to say it in some way. But again, when effects show up, we still drop into the mid 40s, earned just like 10 to 15 extra frames, going from the highest to medium. And yeah, the game does look worse on medium, but I don't think it's a huge difference. Yeah, the reflections are worse, the shadows are of a lower resolution as well, but I just don't think that it's worth going that high. As long as you're on high or medium, it will run similarly and basically look good anyways. The only thing that I do not recommend is to go below medium settings, because when you go below medium to low or lowest on the presets, you basically lose shadows and ambient occlusion, so the game looks like it's 10 years older than it actually is. And if you go to the lowest, there's not even reflections. But yeah, as you can see here, there are no shadows, no ambient occlusion. So yeah, but the game runs significantly better. So yeah, if you go to the lowest, then there's not even reflections going on, only cube maps. And again, no shadows, no ambient occlusion. So yeah, you can get performance that way. But again, when effects show up, you're still going to drop probably below 30 sometimes. So yeah, pretty disappointed with that reality, that the game can still drop below 60 on the lowest settings. It seems that the effects are just too much. I mean, just look at those drops when I do something big on the screen with the effects. We drop from the 80s to the 50s. Just ridiculous. So yeah, this is why I recommend in the settings, stay basically on medium or high settings depending on your card. Disable motion blur because it's very annoying in this game in particular. And then here I recommend the dynamic resolution. Even if you're doing 30 frames per second, just do dynamic resolution, because when you're trying to aim for that frame rate, the game will just dynamically drop the resolution, so you don't drop into below that frame rate. So let's aim for 60 with medium settings. So this means that the game is basically on medium settings all the time, but it's dropping below 1080p when necessary to stay at 60 frames per second. And as you were probably seeing, not sure if this video shows it clearly, it's already way below 1080p, probably between 900p and 720p, but that's because there are effects on screen. When there's not much going on, the game will be basically at 1080p, on the campaign especially. This is not the campaign, but there are some levels, more open levels in the campaign, after the 3-hour mark, that will have levels where this happens, that you get a very low frame rate. So yeah, with dynamic resolution you shouldn't have that issue at all. In these demanding areas it will drop below 1080p and it will be noticeable. But if you're just playing the game and not focusing on that, it should be okay. So yeah, remember, big maps plus many effects on screen is what kills the performance, like here. But then just the resolution drops for a second, goes back up, and you'll be okay. So let's now talk about the settings. Again, my advice, medium to high settings. Very high, I mean, it looks a little better, but the performance hit is huge. So medium or high. Remember, below medium or high you won't have reflections, ambient occlusion or shadows, so the game will look significantly worse. So yeah. Okay, so the VFX quality, it says resolution of lighting quality and density of particle effects. I didn't see much of a difference with this on the lowest when there is many effects going on, so you're still dropping there. Tessellation, it'll subdivide the geometry further according to the description. So yeah, the objects will have better geometry. I mean, this is one that I saw the biggest difference, especially in the big cities on the performance side. Screen space contact shadows make the game look better, so there's additional shading going on between smaller objects. I didn't see a huge difference with this one in performance, so you can enable it if you want. Then shadows has a very big performance hit, especially if you turn them off. You can have a way higher frame rate, but you won't have any shadows, so low or high should be okay. Level of detail, well, this is the complexity of the geometry, but the level of detail also includes the at which distance you're seeing objects, so the things that are farther away won't load in until you get very close to them. My advice here is to keep it on high or medium. Ultra, I think, is a little too taxing, especially in these bigger levels. Then on the ambient occlusion, you got HBAO+, SAO, and off. I recommend keeping it on SAO, screen space ambient occlusion. This still looks good enough, and it's not a huge performance hit. If you have a few frames to spare, keep it on HBAO+. It does look more precise, and it's not that taxing on the GPU. I mean, it will decrease your frame rate, but it won't be a huge performance difference. It depends on the level, of course, but in general, I could turn it on just fine using dynamic resolution. Then the screen space reflections, it's the reflections. If you put it on off, there will be only the cube maps, which are the static reflections that are not dynamic at all. Then on, you have the usual screen space reflections, that when you move the camera, it will just take the object that you're looking at and put the same thing flip down. It's what most games nowadays are using. And then you have SSSR, which I never saw before, that are better screen space reflections, sorry. These are more accurate, so they're smoother and more realistic according to the game. This is a big performance hit as well. I recommend to keep it on. You at least have reflections, they are dynamic, so it feels more realistic. With off, it looks very flat, so on I think is a good balance. Motion blur in this game I think is very distracting. I'll just move the camera to show you. But yeah, I mean, this with dynamic resolution I think it looks terrible. Just a very distracting camera motion blur. But if you like it, you can enable it. It won't be a big performance hit. So yeah, I think I'm not missing anything. Well, that fulfilled is the blurry background when you're watching a cutscene, for example, or when you're aiming in certain places, especially in cutscenes. But I mean, high should be fine. I didn't see a huge difference on that one. Yeah, basically those are my thoughts on the options menu and the performance. My advice is to keep it on medium or high. Dynamic resolution 60 or 30, depends on your graphics card. TAA, no motion blur because it's very distracting basically. And yeah. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, texture filtering, keep it on 16 times anisotropic. I didn't see a noticeable performance difference with this on trilinear versus 16 times anisotropic. And the textures look better at the distance, so keep it on 16 times. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the options menu and the performance and what you should do to keep the best visuals with the decent performance target. So yeah, if you have a 1060, something like that, you should be using medium settings, 60 frames dynamic resolution. RX 570, 580 should be the same thing on the graphic settings. On the 580 you could do high textures, you have more VRAM for that. So then on the system RAM side of things, as you can see right now the game is using 12 gigabytes. Well, I saw up to 14 gigabytes of usage while playing this game. So make sure to have more than 8 gigabytes. People with 8 gigabytes told me that the game was unplayable. So I don't know, maybe in smaller levels you can manage it. But in these bigger levels, I never saw the usage being below 8 gigabytes, so make sure to go over 8 gigabytes of system RAM. Then on the video memory side of things, I already talked about this, but if you have less than 4 gigabytes, use low textures. If you have 4 gigs, use medium textures. If you have 6 gigs or more, use high, and that should be fine for the VRAM. And finally on the CPU side, with a quad-core CPU, a modern quad-core CPU, 4 cores, 4 threads, it should be fine, it should be playable. But on the campaign levels, you should expect some stutter, especially when moving to the level from the beginning, when you're loading it for the first time. Then on bigger levels like this one, I expect a lot more stutter, especially when flying around like I'm doing. or when the enemies are first spawning. Other than that, I mean, for 30 frames per second should be fine. Just make sure if you have 4 threads that you're not aiming for 60 frames per second. Just lock it to 30 dynamic resolution, lower the level of detail to medium, and you should be fine. Then if you have more than 4 cores, maybe 4 cores like threads, you should be able to do 60. And if you have more than 8 threads, maybe 6 cores, 12 threads like I have here, it will be totally fine. Oh, and if you have something like an i5 9400F, something of that caliber, I will aim for 60 on those. Seems to be okay with 6 threads as well. But yeah, I think that's all I had to talk about. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know what you think about this in the comment section. I'm trying to do something different. If you like it, again, let me know. If you're not, also let me know. But yeah, thank you so much for watching and see you next time. Bye guys.